Imagine this. You're a young Igbo farmer working your family's fields near present-day Nigeria in 1650 when armed raiders suddenly surround your village at dawn. Within hours, you find yourself bound with rope, marching toward an uncertain fate. This was the terrifying reality for millions of Africans during the 17th century slave trade. The moment of capture marks only the beginning of an elaborate system designed to transform human beings into property. What followed was a calculated process of dehumanization that stripped away identity, culture, and freedom through a series of increasingly brutal stages. From village raids conducted by African kingdoms seeking European firearms to the crowded slave markets of Charleston, where families were permanently separated. These are the systematic stages of African enslavement during the 17th century. Starting with capture methods, the transformation of free Africans into enslaved people began with three distinct methods of capture, each designed to feed the insatiable European demand for human labour. These methods turned entire regions of West and Central Africa into hunting grounds where no one was safe. Warfare represented the most systematic approach to acquiring captives. The Kingdom of Dahomey, located in present-day Benin, transformed itself into a military machine specifically designed for slave raiding. During the 1640s through 1690s, Dahomeyan armies launched carefully planned campaigns against neighbouring villages and rival kingdoms. These were not random attacks but calculated business ventures. The Dahomeyan military understood timing. They struck during harvest season when granaries were full and populations were concentrated in agricultural areas. European firearms traded for previous captives gave these raiders overwhelming advantages over communities still fighting with traditional weapons. A typical Dahomeyan raid began before dawn, with warriors surrounding entire settlements, cutting off escape routes before inhabitants could react. In 1670, Dahomeyan forces surrounded the village of Alada during the yam harvest. Warriors armed with muskets positioned themselves at every exit, while drummers created chaos to prevent organised resistance. Within 3 hours, over 200 villagers found themselves bound and destined for coastal slave ports. The raiders left behind only the elderly and infirm, taking anyone capable of surviving the journey to the Atlantic. Individual kidnapping operations targeted the most vulnerable members of society. Markets became hunting grounds, where slave raiders posed as legitimate traders before seizing unsuspecting victims. Children faced particular danger while performing routine tasks like herding goats or collecting water from distant wells. The Hausa regions of present-day northern Nigeria became notorious for these kidnapping networks. Professional manhunters worked in small groups, identifying isolated individuals before striking. They preferred children between 8 and 15 years old, knowing European buyers valued young captives who could be more easily controlled and trained. Along the trade routes connecting interior regions to coastal ports, ambush tactics became commonplace. Merchants travelling with legitimate goods found themselves surrounded by armed groups who seized both cargo and people. These highway robberies transformed every journey into a potentially life-altering gamble. Judicial enslavement represented perhaps the most insidious capture method because it corrupted traditional African legal systems. Europeans and their African partners manipulated existing laws to create enslaved people through false accusations and debt manipulation. Traditional African societies had systems for resolving disputes and punishing crimes, often involving temporary servitude, as compensation. Slave traders corrupted these systems by bribing judges, fabricating evidence, and creating impossible debt situations designed to trap victims. In the Gold Coast region, present-day Ghana, European traders worked with corrupt local officials to accuse innocent people of witchcraft, theft, or adultery. These accusations carried punishments of enslavement, allowing conspirators to legally seize anyone they desired. The victims had no recourse since the very legal system meant to protect them had become part of the enslavement apparatus. Debt bondage schemes targeted families during times of crisis. When drought, warfare, or disease struck communities, desperate people borrowed food, tools, or money with their freedom as collateral. Lenders deliberately created terms that made repayment impossible, knowing they could claim human beings as payment. A typical debt trap began when a family borrowed grain during a poor harvest. The lender would demand repayment with interest that exceeded what any farming family could reasonably produce. When payment deadlines passed, the lender would claim family members as compensation, often separating children from parents permanently. These capture methods created a climate of terror across vast regions of Africa. Entire communities lived in constant fear, abandoning traditional patterns of agriculture, trade, and social interaction. Parents kept children close to home, travellers moved in armed groups, and villages built defensive fortifications against their own neighbours. The sophistication of these systems revealed the calculated nature of the Atlantic slave trade. This was not random violence, but organised commerce that required planning, financing, and coordination between African raiders and European buyers. Each capture method served specific market demands while destroying the social fabric of African societies. The captured individuals, torn from everything they knew, now faced the beginning of a journey designed to strip away their humanity piece by piece. Their ordeal was far from over. Koffel marches. Once captured, Africans faced brutal forced marches called koffels that transported them from interior regions to coastal slave ports. These journeys covered hundreds of miles through dangerous terrain while bound in chains, transforming the African landscape into a network of human misery. The koffel system represented the first stage of systematic dehumanization designed to break the spirits of captives before they ever saw a European ship. The typical koffel march stretched between 300 and 500 miles, depending on where capture occurred. Captives found themselves shackled with iron chains around their necks, wrists and ankles, connected to other prisoners in long lines that snaked across the African countryside. Wooden yokes, heavy timber devices that locked around necks, prevented individuals from lying down or moving their heads freely. These restraints caused constant pain and made escape nearly impossible. The mortality rate during these marches reached catastrophic levels. For every 5 people who began the journey, 1 would die from exhaustion, disease or violence before reaching the coast. Raiders considered this acceptable loss since the profits from survivors more than compensated for those who perished along the way. The trans-Saharan routes presented some of the most harrowing examples of koffel brutality. In 1673, a group of Hausa captives from present-day northern Nigeria began an 800-mile death march toward the Mediterranean port of Tripoli in Libya. These prisoners, captured during a Tuareg raid on farming communities, faced 6 to 8 weeks crossing the Sahara Desert. The caravan moved during the coolest parts of each day, starting before dawn and stopping when the sun became unbearable. Captives received minimal water rations, barely enough to prevent immediate death from dehydration. Guards on camels rode alongside the human chain, using whips to force exhausted marchers to continue walking across burning sand dunes. During the 3rd week of this particular journey, temperatures soared beyond human endurance. The guards had miscalculated water supplies, leaving the entire caravan facing death in the desert. They began abandoning weaker captives, leaving them chained to rocks to die while the caravan continued toward Tripoli. Of the original 180 Hausa farmers who began this march, only 98 reached the Mediterranean slave markets. The psychological conditioning during koffel marches served purposes beyond simple transportation. Slave raiders deliberately separated family members, mixing people from different ethnic groups who spoke different languages. This prevented communication and made organised resistance almost impossible. A young Yoruba woman captured near present-day Lagos found herself chained between an elderly Igbo man and a teenage Fulani boy during a march toward the Gold Coast. None could understand the other's languages, leaving each person isolated within the group. Guards encouraged this separation, knowing that people who cannot communicate cannot plan escapes or revolts. The introduction of European names began during these marches as another form of psychological assault. Guards assigned new identities to captives, often using simple names like John, Mary, or Peter, that bore no connection to their African heritage. They forced prisoners to respond only to these foreign names, beating anyone who used their birth name or spoke in their native language. This naming process served multiple purposes beyond convenience. It began erasing cultural identity while preparing captives for European buyers who found African names too difficult to pronounce. The psychological impact was devastating, as people lost even their names, the most basic element of personal identity. Physical conditioning accompanied the psychological torture. Guards forced captives to march in formation, respond to simple commands in European languages, and perform basic tasks that plantation owners would expect. This training period transformed proud warriors, farmers, and artisans into people conditioned to follow orders without question. The landscape itself became an enemy during these journeys. Coffle routes crossed rivers where crocodiles posed constant threats, dense forests where disease-carrying insects swarmed the chained prisoners, and mountains where thin air made breathing difficult for people already weakened by malnutrition and abuse. Weather added another layer of suffering. During rainy seasons, mud made walking treacherous, while waterlogged chains caused painful sores that quickly became infected. Dry seasons brought choking dust clouds and scorching heat that killed the weak and elderly. Guards showed no mercy for weather-related delays, maintaining brutal pace regardless of conditions. The arrival at coastal ports marked the end of the Coffle March, but certainly not the end of suffering. Captives who survived this ordeal faced new horrors as they encountered their first glimpse of European slave traders and the massive fortifications designed to hold them until ships arrived. The Coffle had served its purpose, delivering broken human beings ready for the next stage of the enslavement process. These forced marches transformed the African interior into highways of human suffering, while generating enormous profits for everyone involved, except the captives themselves. Barracoons, coastal holding facilities called barracoons, served as the final African destination for captured people before their journey across the Atlantic Ocean. These fortress-like compounds, scattered along Africa's western coastline, functioned as human warehouses where European slave traders prepared their merchandise for sale. The barracoon system transformed the African coast into a network of processing centres designed to maximise profits from human suffering. The most notorious barracoons occupied strategic positions along major shipping routes. Cape Coast Castle, a massive stone fortress on the Gold Coast in present-day Ghana, dominated the surrounding landscape with its thick walls and armed cannons. Gorée Island off the coast of Senegal served as a compact but efficient processing centre, where French traders prepared captives for Caribbean plantations. Luanda in Angola became the largest slave port in Africa, handling thousands of people destined for Brazilian sugar farms. These facilities could hold between 200 and 400 individuals at any given time, packed into underground dungeons or cramped wooden barracks. The architecture deliberately maximised capacity while minimising comfort, treating human beings like cargo awaiting shipment. Stone walls prevented escape, while small windows provided barely enough air to prevent immediate death from suffocation. Daily life in the barracoons followed brutal routines designed to prepare captives for plantation work. Guards woke prisoners before dawn, forcing them into courtyards where they received meagre portions of rice, yams, or cornmeal. The food contained just enough nutrition to keep people alive, but insufficient to restore strength lost during Coffle marches. Cape Coast Castle's dungeons revealed the systematic dehumanization process in horrific detail. In 1685, a group of Ashanti prisoners found themselves crammed into windowless chambers, carved from solid rock beneath the castle's main structure. The ceiling stood so low that adults could not stand upright, forcing everyone to remain hunched over or sitting in their own waste. These Ashanti captives, once proud warriors who had defended their homeland against rival kingdoms, now faced daily humiliations designed to break their spirits. Guards entered the dungeons each morning, with red-hot iron brands bearing the marks of different European trading companies. Each person received a permanent scar burned into their shoulder or chest, marking them as property of specific buyers. The branding process served multiple purposes beyond simple identification. The searing pain and permanent disfigurement reinforced the message that captives no longer controlled their own bodies. The smell of burning flesh and screams of fellow prisoners created psychological trauma that made resistance seem hopeless. Medical examinations followed branding ceremonies as European doctors inspected their potential purchases. These examinations resembled livestock evaluations more than human medical care. Doctors checked teeth for signs of age and disease, examined muscles for strength indicators, and searched for scars or deformities that might reduce market value. At Gorée Island, French traders employed a physician named Dr. Rousseau, who conducted these examinations with clinical detachment. In 1682, Rousseau inspected a group of Wolof people captured from Senegalese villages during harvest season. He rejected elderly individuals and anyone showing signs of illness, condemning them to death since they had no commercial value. Rousseau's accepted captives faced preparation procedures designed to maximize selling prices. Guards forced them to exercise in small courtyards, rebuilding muscle mass lost during imprisonment. They received oil treatments that made their skin appear healthier and more attractive to buyers. Women and children underwent additional grooming to enhance their appeal in household slave markets. The psychological preparation proved as important as physical conditioning. European traders introduced basic vocabulary in English, French, Portuguese, or Spanish, depending on their intended destinations. Captives learned simple commands like come, stop, and work, along with responses to their newly assigned European names. Language instruction served dual purposes of practical communication and cultural destruction. Guards punished anyone caught speaking African languages, using whips and isolation to enforce European linguistic dominance. This process began erasing cultural connections that might inspire resistance or rebellion. Gorée Island's Door of No Return, a stone archway leading directly to waiting ships, symbolised the finality of the Barracoon experience. Captives who walked through this portal would never again see African soil, and the traders made sure everyone understood this reality. The waiting periods in barracoons could last weeks or months depending on ship schedules and market conditions. During these delays, captives watched other groups disappear through the doors while wondering about their own fate. The uncertainty created additional psychological pressure that left people emotionally drained before their ocean voyage even began. European traders used this time to separate families permanently, selling individuals to different buyers based on market demand rather than human relationships. Children watched their parents disappear onto ships bound for distant continents, knowing they would never reunite. The Barracoon system represented the final African chapter in the enslavement process, transforming captured people into commodities ready for international sale. These coastal fortresses efficiently processed human beings like any other export product, maximizing European profits while destroying African lives and families forever. Market sales. The final transformation of captured Africans into enslaved laborers occurred in slave markets scattered throughout the Americas, where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. These marketplaces operated with ruthless efficiency, using different auction methods designed to maximize profits, while completing the dehumanization process that began in African villages months earlier. Two primary auction systems dominated the slave trade during the 17th century. The scramble method created chaotic scenes where buyers rushed to claim their preferred captives, while individual bidding auctions allowed for more deliberate evaluation and competitive pricing. Both systems treated human beings as merchandise, stripping away the last vestiges of dignity from people already traumatized by capture, coffle marches, and barracoon imprisonment. The scramble system reached its most brutal expression in Calabar, a port city in present-day Nigeria, where European ships loaded captives directly from African traders. This method resembled a violent shopping spree, where buyers paid fixed prices before racing to seize the people they wanted most. In 1687, the English ship Fortune arrived in Calabar, carrying plantation representatives from Jamaica and Barbados. Captain William Davies had negotiated a price of £23 per person with local African merchants who controlled the regional slave trade. When Davies opened the ship's hold, revealing 280 terrified captives, the scramble began with shocking brutality. Buyers rushed forward with ropes and chains, grabbing anyone who appeared young and healthy. The scene descended into chaos as purchasers fought over the same individuals, while captives screamed in terror and confusion. A Jamaican sugar plantation overseer named Thomas Whitley knocked down a competitor to seize a teenage Igbo boy, dragging him away while his sister watched helplessly from across the deck. The scramble method deliberately created panic that prevented captives from understanding what was happening or resisting effectively. Within 30 minutes, families were permanently separated as different buyers claimed parents, children, and siblings for plantations scattered across the Caribbean islands. Individual bidding auctions in Charleston, South Carolina, represented a more organized but equally dehumanizing approach to human sales. The city's slave market operated from a wooden platform where auctioneers displayed captives one by one, while buyers evaluated their potential value through physical examination and questioning. Charleston's market served the tobacco plantations of Virginia and the emerging rice farms of the Carolina Low Country, a region where enslaved Africans would transform swamplands into profitable agricultural operations. Buyers came to Charleston seeking specific types of workers based on their plantation needs and the skills they required. During a typical Charleston auction in 1692, an auctioneer named Robert Ellis presented a group of recently arrived Angolans to a crowd of plantation representatives and household buyers. Ellis forced each person to walk across the platform while describing their apparent age, physical condition, and estimated work capacity to potential purchasers. A middle-aged Kimbundu woman named Nzinga found herself standing alone on the platform, while strange men examined her hands for calluses that might indicate farming experience. They opened her mouth to check her teeth, felt her arms for muscle strength, and discussed her potential value in a language she could not understand. Ellis started the bidding at £15, knowing that skilled female workers commanded lower prices than young men, but still represented valuable investments for household work and field labour. Two buyers competed for Nzinga, a rice plantation overseer who needed experienced farmers, and a Charleston merchant seeking domestic servants for his household. The plantation overseer won with a bid of £19, sealing Nzinga's fate as a rice farm labourer in the deadly swamps, where malaria and exhaustion killed many workers within their first years. She would never see her homeland again or reunite with family members sold to other buyers during the same auction. Different types of buyers attended these markets, based on their specific labour needs and financial resources. Sugar plantation agents from the Caribbean islands sought young, strong workers who could survive the brutal conditions of cane cultivation. Tobacco farm representatives from Virginia and Maryland preferred people with agricultural experience who could adapt to different farming techniques. Household service purchasers looked for different qualities, seeking individuals who appeared intelligent and trainable for domestic work in colonial cities. These buyers often paid premium prices for people who seemed capable of learning European languages quickly or possessed skills like cooking, sewing, or metalworking. The Royal African Company, a British organisation that held exclusive rights to supply enslaved Africans to English colonies, documented their sales with business-like precision. In 1672, company records from Barbados showed average prices of £23 sterling per person, with variations based on age, apparent health, and estimated skills. Young adult males commanded the highest prices because plantation owners considered them capable of the heaviest labour and most likely to survive harsh working conditions. Women and children sold for lower amounts, though pregnant women sometimes brought premium prices since buyers would own both mother and child. These market sales completed the transformation of free Africans into enslaved Americans, finalising transactions that would determine the remainder of their lives. The auction blocks scattered throughout colonial ports became the final stops on journeys that began in African villages and ended in permanent bondage thousands of miles from home. Final destinations. The enslaved Africans who survived capture, coffle marches, barracoons and auction blocks faced their ultimate fate in three primary destinations that would define the remainder of their lives: Caribbean sugar colonies, North American mainland plantations, and northern colonial cities. Each demanded different types of labour while offering varying chances of survival. These final destinations completed the transformation from free Africans to enslaved Americans, though some would refuse to accept their bondage without resistance. The Caribbean sugar islands represented the most deadly destination for enslaved Africans, consuming human lives at an alarming rate to fuel European demand for sweetened products. Barbados and Jamaica became massive sugar factories where enslaved people worked themselves to death, producing wealth for absent plantation owners living comfortably in London. Barbados received approximately 50,000 enslaved Africans between 1650 and 1700, transforming the small island into one enormous sugar plantation. The work regimen began before sunrise and continued past sunset during harvest season, when enslaved people cut cane stalks under the tropical sun before feeding them into grinding mills that crush fingers along with sugar cane. Jamaica's sugar plantations proved even more brutal, importing 120,000 enslaved Africans during the same 50-year period. The average life expectancy for newly arrived Africans dropped to just 7 years due to overwork, malnutrition, disease and violence from overseers who treated human beings as replaceable machinery. A young Akan man named Kwame arrived in Jamaica in 1675 after surviving the Middle Passage from the Gold Coast. Plantation owner Samuel Beckford purchased him for £28 to work on his sugar estate in the Blue Mountains. Kwame found himself assigned to a gang of field workers who cut sugarcane from dawn until dusk, while armed overseers on horseback watched for any signs of slowness or resistance. The sugar boiling houses presented additional dangers, where enslaved people worked around massive iron cauldrons filled with boiling cane juice. The heat was unbearable, burns were common, and exhausted workers sometimes collapsed into the boiling liquid. Kwame watched fellow Africans die from heat stroke, infected wounds, and sheer exhaustion while plantation profits soared. North American mainland destinations offered slightly better survival chances, but still demanded back-breaking labour under harsh conditions. Virginia's tobacco plantations required enslaved people to tend the delicate tobacco plants through lengthy growing seasons, while South Carolina's rice plantations forced workers to cultivate crops in disease-infested swamps. The Chesapeake region of Virginia and Maryland became the centre of tobacco production, where enslaved Africans learned to plant, tend, harvest and cure tobacco leaves for export to European markets. This work was less immediately deadly than sugar cultivation, but still required long hours in hot fields while dealing with tobacco's toxic effects on workers' health. A woman named Amara, originally from Senegal, found herself working on a Virginia tobacco plantation owned by Robert Carter in 1688. She learned to transplant tiny tobacco seedlings, remove harmful insects by hand, and hang tobacco leaves in curing barns where the smell was overwhelming. Unlike Caribbean plantations, Virginia allowed enslaved people small garden plots where they could grow food to supplement meagre rations. South Carolina's rice plantations exploited the agricultural knowledge that many West Africans brought from their homelands, where rice cultivation was already well established. Plantation owners specifically sought people from rice-growing regions, knowing their expertise would make the plantations profitable. Northern colonial cities created different types of bondage, where enslaved people worked as household servants, artisans and labourers in growing urban areas like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. These positions offered better living conditions than plantation work, but still denied freedom and separated families. Despite overwhelming oppression, many enslaved Africans refused to accept their fate without resistance. The mountains of Jamaica became home to maroon communities where escaped enslaved people built independent settlements and fought successful wars against colonial authorities throughout the 1670s and 1680s. These Maroons, led by warriors like Queen Nanny and Captain Cudjoe, established fortified towns in Jamaica's interior mountains, where they preserved African customs, languages, and fighting techniques. They raided plantations to free other enslaved people and proved that resistance was possible even under the most oppressive conditions. The famous Pueblo Revolt in New Mexico during 1680 saw enslaved Africans join Native American warriors in driving Spanish colonizers from the region. These African participants had been brought to New Mexico to work in Spanish households and mines, but they seized the opportunity to fight for freedom alongside Pueblo peoples who shared their hatred of colonial oppression. Throughout these destinations, enslaved Africans preserved elements of their cultural heritage through music, religion, storytelling, and cooking. They created new traditions that blended African customs with American experiences, laying foundations for cultures that would survive centuries of oppression. The final destinations of captured Africans became the starting points for new African American communities that would endure slavery, resist when possible, and eventually achieve freedom through their own efforts and determination. Their journey from free Africans to enslaved Americans was complete, but their story of survival and resistance was just beginning.